Welcome back to the Road to 2000s. My name is Caleb Denby. As always, I'm your driver on this road. Hopefully we'll all arrive at 2000 safely together. So if you saw the class last week, what I wanted to talk about was tactical motifs, because I feel like that's a lot of what weaker players and beginner players need to work on. But a lot of players run into this problem where, okay, they learn these patterns, they do tactics, but they're actually unable to put it into effect in their games. So what I wanted to talk about today is a pretty broad topic. It's basically recognizing tactics in your games, recognizing where they show up, when they show up, and why they show up. So basically the plan for today is I'm just going to go through 5 different games of all different levels, and we'll see how tactics show up and how they differ from each other in the different levels of games. So this first game I'm going to go over is actually from the Chess Club Staff Tournament. It was very exciting, and it was between Jesse Richardson, who is kind of a casual chess player. He just likes playing the game. He never really spent much time studying it and trying to get very good. And Kyle Weber, who's one of our Scholastic coordinators. He helps run all our Scholastic programs. And he's about 1,500 USCF. So he's spent some time and he's gotten a bit better at chess. So I wanted to go over how tactics show up in a game between a slightly more beginner player like Jesse and a player who's been playing for a while now, like Kyle. And we'll see how the tactics work out, how Kyle managed to gain an advantage and eventually win. So just jumping right off, he went d4, Jesse did, which is totally fine. An opening move, guarding the center, knight f6, knight f3, e6, knight c3. So already this move is a bit weird from Jesse. It doesn't really follow the normal plans for the structure, but that's fine. He's by no means worse at this point. Kyle went for c5, attacking this center pawn, especially since Jesse didn't get the c pawn in the game to help defend this pawn or help defend this d5 square. Jesse just played e3, which is fine, just defends the pawn. C takes d4, e takes d4, a6, bishop d3, developing moves. d6 from Kyle. This move is also a little bit weird. Probably he should have just controlled the center in the normal fashion, but he wanted to keep an eye on this dark e5 square. So white goes ahead and castles, bishop e7, bishop e3. And so white has pretty much got most of his pieces developed. Now let me ask the live audience here, is this a position where tactics are going to start flowing already? Are there already going to be like a lot of tactics here?
I don't think so, not yet.
Why not?
There's not too many opportunities for tactics, first of all.
Yeah. So when you say opportunities for tactics, what are you looking for that makes you think, okay, here I've got to have a tactic here. I've got to have something that I should look out for?
I mean, all the pieces are pretty much like nothing's being attacked and nothing's being...
Right.
Yeah.
So nothing is being attacked, and white's not really working together, coordinating on a single point at all. And so this is not really a position where tactics are going to occur. So a couple of things that we need to look out for in tactics, and we'll touch more on this when they actually show up, is loose pieces. So what do I mean when I say loose pieces? Do you know what that means?
Undefended?
Yeah, so undefended pieces, pieces that are further advanced than they should be, pieces that are maybe defended once, but obviously could use some more defending. So when pieces are loose, that's when tactics kind of show up. And then there's one other huge criteria I wanted to touch on as well. So we have loose pieces, and then also if your pieces are just much more active than your opponent's. Piece activity, as well as looser undefended pieces. That's what kind of makes tactics show up. And so it's learning to recognize when you have active pieces, when your opponent does not, and when your opponent has loose pieces. That's what you want to learn to recognize to find tactics in your own games. So let's see how this continued. Black castles, bishop g5, knight b d7, d5. So already, this should raise some alarm bells. Why does d5, raise some alarms in your head right away?
He's hanging it.
Yeah, it's moving to a square where it's attacked, right?
Twice.
Yeah, it's attacked twice and only defended once. So this is a moment when you're playing with the white pieces, maybe you're a more beginner player, and you're trying to find your move, right? and you think, oh, maybe this d5 move looks good. It's attacking my opponent, right? And so this is when you have to start being very careful and start looking very carefully at the position. This is like the first step to recognizing when tactics are going to happen, especially to you. You need to see when you're moving into enemy territory, when your pieces are a bit more loose, or when like they're on an attacked square even. So here, black has a tactic already. He can take this pawn. He can take it in two different ways. Which way do you think he should capture?
Probably with a knight.
Yeah, why take it with the knight?
You don't want double pawns.
Well, what would happen if white just captured here? Would you have to double the pawns anyways?
No, you just take the bishop.
Yeah, so this is making use of white's only other loose piece, under-defended piece, He's moved two pieces into kind of enemy territory here, his bishop and his pawn, and both of them together make a tactic that works. Black can capture this pawn on d5, and maybe what white was thinking was, if he just takes here with the pawn, that's not so bad for me, right? This pawn is going to be very weak, and maybe I can win it back. But unfortunately, black does have this tactic, knight takes d5, and the reason that this works is because white had two loose pieces, and that allows black to do this tactic. So if white were to try to recapture here, trying to double these pawns, black would actually just capture on g5, and that would be completely fine for him. And if he were to take on e7, again, with the idea of taking here, black can actually just retreat his knight and recapture, and black would just be up a healthy pawn. So this is kind of how tactics start showing up at the most basic level. White, he's kind of a casual player. He just wants to move his pawns forward, and he's only made two loose pieces, but together already a tactic is working. Kyle actually chose to play knight c5, which is a bit worse than just cleanly winning the pawn, but it by no means is black any worse here. Bishop e2. White didn't want to lose this bishop, and it does add another defender to this pawn. Unfortunately, this tactic still does work for black. You can still just capture here. Whoops. Whoops, we lost internet connection. Okay, we're back. Bishop takes e7 and knight takes e7. And now this pawn is a bit weaker than it was before, but black would still just be up a pawn. Instead, Kyle still didn't notice this. So even at the 1500 level, it's all about noticing, hey, this piece is loose, can I make something work? Because I'm sure Kyle was capable of calculating this. He just didn't really look for it. So knight e4 instead, trading the bishops. Threatening to trade the bishops. And again, your opponent makes a threatening looking move. You should notice this piece is a bit loose, it's a bit overextended and underdefended. And so white didn't notice though, and now of course black just wins the bishop. And I'll just quickly go through and see how black eventually did win. We see that white made a threat, actually. Black defended well, though. I don't want to spend too much time on this. And then we have another loose piece situation, right? This queen is out kind of on its own with no other pieces, and it runs into this discovered attack, and this bishop is also loose. So notice how whenever there's a tactic, it always seems like white's pieces are misplaced or kind of overextended and loose. And that's really when you need to turn on the brain, think really hard, okay, is there any way I can take advantage of my opponent's piece placement? So after the queen, the game ended very shortly with checkmate on f2. So Kyle won that one, but no worries, later in the staff tournament, he had to play me. All right, and now I wanted to feature our very own Perry Colson, who you may know from our famous Twitch live streams that are going on now. He's also in the room with us. And this is a game, Perry might be a little bit embarrassed about, but there's really no reason to be, because he ended up winning in the end. So let's see, how he kind of went awry to start off with, and then how his opponent went further awry. So we have a Budapest defense, actually, Budapest gambit.
I've never encountered that ever.
Yeah, first time Perry had seen it, first time. So he correctly surmises that black's pawn is undefended, and he captures it like a champion. Knight g4, so black is just attempting to
I know I should have played
regain this pawn.
I should have played bishop c4.
Yeah, and so bishop f4 is the main
Bishop
move.
F4, excuse me.
Knight f3 is by no means a bad move. Just knight c6, knight c3. Here probably white should have defended this pawn because now it's open to capture. It's also open to bishop b4 maybe could happen. Instead we see bishop b4, and this gives white a chance to actually defend his pawn. But now, you know, this is actually just an opening line in the Budapest. I prefer to put this knight on b2 where it can't be captured on c3 like this, but by no means has any player done anything wrong here. Queen e7. And now white made a pretty substantial mistake. So he played bishop to g5.
Yep, and I
So,
thought
yeah.
about it for so long before I made that move, like seriously, like 10
So yeah,
minutes.
why is this move wrong, first of all?
First of all, you moved the same piece twice in the opening,
Mm-hmm.
and you undefended your pawn.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
there are a couple things wrong with it. Is this bishop was serving a very useful purpose on f4 in defending this pawn. And you've also moved it twice now. You've kind of done a stutter step between f4 and g5. And you don't really want to be moving the same piece over and over again in the opening like this. It's definitely going to lead to problems. And
It soon does.
so yeah.
It's okay.
And the third thing I wanted to mention is this bishop is a bit loose on g5, right? On f4, it's undefended, but it's kind of closer to home. And maybe after e3, this bishop will be defended, because e3 I think would be the right move here. This bishop will be defended, it's still defending the pawn, and you're also getting this bishop developed at the same time. So he's made a loose piece. So it's not a problem yet, but it might be a problem later in the game, right? This is what we always want to be thinking about. We want to be looking at the loose pieces to recognize if we have a tactic. So queen to c5 is played, which actually is threatening checkmate. Well, not quite checkmate, but you know what I mean. So e3 is correct, just defending against the threat. Now knight takes e5. And now already we can kind of see an X-ray attack, one of the tactical motifs I went over last week, is kind of occurring on this bishop. And also we're looking out for maybe an intermezzo and a discovered attack eventually. So all of these motifs have suddenly appeared. And they didn't come out of nowhere. They came because, first of all, black has more active pieces. All his pieces are developed. Meanwhile, white is still, finishing development. If you want to just go by numbers, you can count this queen as another developed piece that white doesn't really have yet. So black is more developed, he's more active, and white has a loose piece. This is what leads to tactics. So this is what you really want to look out for. Be very aware when you move your pieces forward into undefended spaces, and especially when they're this close to opponent territory. That's a very common mistake that I see, and that's why all these tactics show up in all your games. So here, what do you think white should have done to try to save as much material as he could?
Probably should have moved the bishop back.
Yeah, I think moving the bishop back,
Yeah.
or perhaps capturing the knight first and then moving the bishop back, is the best that white can really do. There is also this idea of playing something like queen to d5, I think, which does defend this pawn, and maybe, if you're lucky, you can get a piece trade in. And I think this would still be okay for black, but okay for white, but maybe I would still prefer black in that position. Instead, we got bishop to e2, and then I'm sure you can all find this tactic. Any ideas?
I know it.
Yeah, Perry knows it. How to win the bishop.
It's 2 ways, actually.
There are 2 ways.
Well, yeah, there's 2 move orders with the same idea. But yeah, of course, the main idea is this knight takes f3 check. Black in the game inserted bishop takes c3, which doesn't really change anything. And now we see knight takes f3 with the attack on the bishop and the attack on the king. And at the end of the day, black is simply up a piece.
I almost resigned here.
And Perry almost threw in the towel,
I
but
said just fight on.
but yeah, obviously at these levels, anything can really happen in any game. So you definitely don't want to just give up. And something else that I see a lot of players do is they keep on playing, but they kind of stop thinking about their moves. They kind of just go through the motions, and that's the same as resigning pretty much. You have to really stay in the game and keep thinking about ways to mix it up and keep things complicated. Instead, we see castle instead of resigns. Castles, queen c2. Knight e7. Already this move is a little bit strange. Maybe black was worried about doubling the pawns, but that's not really a threat. He should really just be getting his pieces out. Instead, we see knight e7, rook to b1, putting pressure on this pawn, so black responds with c6. Rook to d1. Already, white is activating his pieces. So this is what's allowing him to find some tactics in the future, is getting these active pieces. Knight to f5. Again, maybe we should be looking for ways to develop this bishop, although knight f5 I don't think is a bad move. Bishop e4. Now we finally do see d6, defending the knight, and preparing to develop the bishop. Rook back to f1. Not my favorite move, but it does have an idea behind it. You see rook to e8. Now actually f4, and this was white's idea, which I'm having a hard time endorsing this because
It was a long shot, I know. I just thought try something.
Yeah, because it does make quite a bit of weaknesses, and it leaves a lot of pieces loose. But it is nice in the fact that you found a way to get your rook into an active position. So the heart behind the move was fine.
It's black. No, I would have taken.
Taken what?
Knight
e3?
Yeah.
So yeah, you might think you have a tactic here with knight takes e3, because again, there's a loose piece, so you definitely want to be looking for the tactic. It does actually lose a piece back, though, at the end of the day. Black would lose a knight, whereas white lost just one pawn, I think. But yeah, that's good. You want to be recognizing, hey, my opponent just made a weird-looking move. It left a piece undefended. I should be checking for tactics. Instead, we saw queen h5. White defends his pawn and develops his rook via a different route than he originally chose. And now black thinks he has a tactic here. Black sees, hey, wait a second. I have this queen and this rook and this knight, and this bishop can kind of come into the game too. It feels like I should have something here. Because first of all, this piece I think qualifies as loose. It's not undefended, but is attacked once and defended once, so that makes it kind of loose. And these pieces are all a little discoordinated. So black was correct in thinking, hey, maybe I have something here. How do I make something work? So what tactical motifs and what ideas do you see for black, possibly, without checking the actual game notation?
The rook and the queen are lined up?
Yeah, so that's something to point out. We know the tactical motif of a skewer or a pin, right? And we know that maybe if we somehow had a bishop on this diagonal, we could be winning, the rook by attacking the queen, making the queen move, and then taking the rook. So that's one idea that you can see. You can recognize this pattern, and you're like, okay, I know that it looks like these are lined up for a skewer. Is there any way I can make a skewer happen? And then you can just search for a way to make that happen. Well, first of all, you have to get rid of this bishop, so that might lead you to thinking about rook takes e4. But then you might notice, hey, well, I can't really bring my bishop to f5 with this knight in the way. And that's actually how black arrived at his at the sequence he played in the game. I obviously am not a mind reader, but that's the kind of thought process you can kind of think about to lead you to find tactics like this.
I know what you did.
Yeah. So any ideas? How can he vacate the f5 square and set up for this skewer?
Knight h4.
Yeah, so he plays knight h4, winning a tempo on the rook, right? So now the rook has to move, and now he actually plays this sacrifice, rook takes e4, queen takes e4, with the idea of bishop f5. So this was all very well done by black, but he missed something. What did he miss?
It's white's move now, right?
Yeah, it's a very simple move by white, which is easy to understand why black didn't give it too much thought.
Are you asking them what white moved?
Yeah, what do you think white did? Which prevents black from taking his rook on b1.
Well, it doesn't prevent it, but...
Yeah, so it's the only move that doesn't lose the queen. Queen to d4. And then black took the rook, but what does white have now?
Checkmate.
Yeah, it's simply checkmate. And this is actually how the game ended. Perry won by checkmate. through a little bit of cunning, a little bit of hustling, I think.
Luck.
You know, I don't know, at the board, would you like, ah, man.
No, when he
Queen D4, I can't look. Don't do it.
poker face.
Ah.
No, when he go back a few moves.
Yeah.
Right. Like, we'll move the knight.
Yep.
And then when he took, then I saw it. After I moved my rook, I saw it. I said, "Please take my take my."
So you're happy to see that.
Yes. And then I saw it, and then I was praying. But right here on the computer, it's even. I checked it. Right here, it's even.
Black's a bit better, I think.
Tiny bit, not much.
Yeah.
On the engine.
Not much.
We can turn on the engine,
Right
but
here, it's I think it's like one pawn.
yeah, perhaps. But I mean, let's not bother with that because it takes forever to load. But
Can we go back to
But
the
yeah, I
start
mean,
of this tactic?
Black would maybe try
Yeah,
to
but
defend
yeah,
this and maybe Rook G5 here, Queen E2, and something like takes wouldn't work. So maybe not Rook G5, maybe just takes here.
All right, can we go back to the start of this?
Yeah, we can go back to the beginning of the tactic. So yeah, basically all in all, I do want to touch on this move here. You do have to pay attention to what your opponent's doing, obviously. And it's not too late for Black to save this game with something like Knight to G6,
Right, I mean,
or
anyway,
Pawn to G6, or Bishop to G6. But yeah, obviously the game ended like this, much to Jason's chagrin. But okay, the beginning of the tactic. What did you want to look at?
So I had the idea of playing D5 first. First
Yeah.
distracting the bishop and then going Knight H4.
So the move D5 here. Okay. Yeah, so it looks like the problem is going to be I can just take this and then play Bishop D3 maybe.
Okay. Yes.
The tactic doesn't work unless you can take the bishop.
Yeah, but I mean, this is another tactic where you can win this pawn maybe. Maybe winning this pawn is all you need. Although actually I'm not sure you can. Yeah, this might be falling for more tricks, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, Black definitely has to be careful, right? Because Black does meet some of the criteria for hoping there's a tactic in his position. This piece is loose, but he has problems of his own, right? We see that he does have this kind of weak back rank if something were to go wrong. This bishop isn't yet developed. He's looking for ways to develop it with tempo. And these pieces are all kind of loose, right? So both sides might have tactics here, which is why you have to be extremely, extremely cautious in positions like this. But yeah, so the point, again, I want to hammer home. Obviously, there's a lot of things that happened in this game. A lot of mistakes were made. But it's all about recognizing, hey, my opponent's pieces are pretty active. I have some problems in my position. I need to be careful here. Or, thinking, hey, my opponent has some loose pieces. He has a weak back rank. He has, I have threats on G7 maybe. What can I do to try to, cobble something together? It's all about recognizing when you have tactics. So yeah, this first game was a game between a beginner and a 1500. This was a game between Perry, who's past the beginner level now. I'd say he's about 1200. And so now we're going to go up significantly from there. And this is a game that I recently had. It was a rapid game against Neil Deshpande, who is a member of the club. And he is around 1750, I think, 1700, maybe 1800. And so let's see what tactics look like at this level, this next level up here. So we see d4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, d5. So we have a Gruenfeld defense, and I'm just going to go through it rather quickly. We exchanged, and the point of this opening is Black puts a lot of pressure on this d4 pawn, and White tries to maintain kind of a strong center, is I think a simple way to put it. So we have castles, bishop e2, knight c6, castles, bishop g4, and I played rook b1. After the game, I kind of talked with my opponent, and he thought maybe you should have captured here first before bishop g4, maybe you should have done a few things differently, but the way he played it I don't think was too bad. Bishop g4, rook b1. Yeah. So this is actually slightly a mistake, because it allows Black to simplify into a fairly simple endgame with something like this. And I wouldn't have much advantage here. Black wouldn't have much advantage here. It'd kind of just be equal. But my opponent decided not to go for that, and instead defended his b-pawn with b6.
Was that a mistake?
Yeah, I would say so. I think Black really had to just go for this equal ending, which you can kind of qualify
You
this.
should have just taken
Yeah, just
C pawn, right?
taken here,
Taken there.
gotten rid of all these pawns,
Oh, I see.
and achieved an equal position. You can kind of count this as a tactic because this piece you could say is loose. You know, it's defended 1, 2, 3 times, but it's attacked. Well, it's defended 4 times and attacked 4 times, but you can remove a defender and then win that pawn. In exchange, white gets this loose piece on b7, but it would have just equaled out in the end, which you just see all that by calculating through and making sure you've seen everything.
Dumb question, but
Mhm.
like, when you're counting up defenders and attackers, if there's a piece on a square, what do you call that? Is that a defender or an attacker? Or
It's yeah. So the question was, if you're trying to count defenders of a pawn and attackers of a pawn or a piece, do you count the piece on the square as anything? And the answer is you really don't. And when you're counting attackers and defenders, there doesn't even have to be a piece there. It could just be of a square. Can I move to this square, threatening something else? So yeah, this pawn is basically nothing. So once this pawn would capture, it no longer is an attacker, and so I would have 4 defenders, or 4 attackers to 3 defenders, is the way you would count that now. Which is why he has to capture here before he can capture here. But okay, so none of that happens. Black instead decided to just defend his pawn. And now I played the correct move, which is to push through, which is removing this tactic where he can remove my defender and capture my pawn. This knight is loose and attacked, so he has to move it. He goes to a5, which is kind of the edge of the board, but it's a common idea in the Gruenfeld, is trying to control this square. I just continued development with queen c2. Yeah, I think knight a5 was correct here. The only other option is really to take on f3 like this, when maybe I take with the bishop, maybe I take with the pawn, I'm actually not sure. Let's say pawn takes, and then he can come to this e5 square. But the thing is, he kind of gets kicked away right away. And maybe he was a bit afraid of seeing this come down the board. Yeah. So he went to a5 instead. I guess you can consider knight b8 an option with the idea of coming back this way, but yeah, I'm not so sure about it. So knight a5 is fine. I play queen c2, defending this pawn and connecting the rooks. And again, probably tactics aren't going to show up just yet, because we've both done a pretty good job. We've both developed, and you can count this bishop as being loose, but there's no way for me to really take advantage of it, because I don't have any good discoveries. Nothing that I can really capture. He can just take here after any of those moves. And this knight you might think is loose, but it is defended by this pawn, and there's not much I can do about that for the moment. So there's not really any tactics flowing here just yet. We see queen to d6, c4. So I'm, adding an extra defender to this pawn, and maybe I'm thinking about ways I can take advantage of this knight. Maybe I'll play something like bishop to d2, and black will start feeling a little uncomfortable, because this knight is way out here, kind of on its own. We see rook a to d8. I play a4. So now I'm actually kind of preparing to play bishop to d2, so I can push through with a5. And I wouldn't call these tactics yet. This is more of a positional plan, is pushing this pawn through and trying to take on b6. But the tactics will come later, I promise. So we see bishop to c8. And this was kind of a strange idea. I think what he wanted to go for is something like bishop to a6 and putting pressure on this pawn, but it is all a bit kind of too much. It's kind of misplacing his pieces. So I played bishop to d2 as I planned. Plays knight to b7 because he didn't want to let me take here and open this file for my rook. Fair enough. So he plays knight to b7 instead. I just develop my rook. I'm not trying to do anything fancy. I'm just getting my pieces active, because once the pieces are active, that's when tactics flow. So now black plays f5. So I consider this to be a pretty huge mistake. Why do you think that is? Without looking at concrete lines, you can already tell that this move is not going to be good.
Well, he just opened up his king. He just opened up that diagonal.
Yeah, so not only did he open up his king, he opened up the position in general, right? He opened up the center. And when you're opening things up, you want to be sure you're the person with the more active pieces. Otherwise, the tactics kind of flow against you. Your opponent has more options. If he has more active pieces, there are more things he can do, more things he can attack, and usually something ends up falling. So we just look at the pieces here. This bishop's only on the 2nd rank, but it controls a lot of key squares. This bishop is also only on the second rank. I'd say this is my least active piece, but it can easily be activated on this new open diagonal. This rook is well placed for the opening of this file, and this knight is well placed to jump into some key squares, right? So all my pieces are kind of ready for this opening of the game. Whereas, I mean, he has a knight on b7, right? There's knight can almost not legally move. The only square it can go to is back to a5, which it doesn't want to do. This bishop is stuck on the 8th rank. Maybe he's going to activate it, though, if I capture. This rook and this queen may look okay. They're placed on the center file, but they're actually just looking at this pawn, which is achieving nothing. And this rook and this bishop, I would say, are well placed. So black has maybe 2, 3 well-placed pieces, whereas nearly all of my pieces are ready to open the position, ready to attack things, ready to get into the game. So of course, I take and open up the position, because I'm ready for it. He plays bishop takes, activating his bishop, and I play bishop d3. So my least active piece is now trading off for black's maybe most active piece. He doesn't want to do this, so he just plays bishop to g4. But this still leaves my queen and bishop, on a battery aimed at the king. And tactics are going to be coming soon, right? Already I can be looking for ways to try to win material somehow, to try to break through. Maybe on the king's side, maybe I have some sort of sacrifices to think about. Maybe I can, bring this bishop in to c3, trade off another one of black's good pieces. Maybe I can try to get my rooks in, try to double up on this weak pawn, right? So we see piece activity, and we see loose pieces and a weak king. So that's what means I can be looking for tactics here. I start off with just knight g5. We see bishop d4. So black is attacking my only kind of loose or weak point in a f2. I simply defend it. He plays queen f6. I go ahead and take on d4, opening up my rook again, trading off one of black's most active pieces. C takes d4. This knight is attacked. I decided to move it to e6. So this is a fork, which now forces black to trade off kind of his last active piece that isn't just on the f file. I take with the rook. He plays queen g5. And finally, something has slipped in black's position.
So you just took with the rook just to threaten his queen, right?
Well, yeah, it activates. It also is activating my rook. It gains time against the queen, and it allows me to, maybe double up. Maybe I have other ideas. But queen g5 was kind of the final straw. Something has gone wrong for black, and now I can play a tactic. So what do you think?
Sack the bishop.
Yeah, sack the bishop, right? So we see a loose piece here, a weak king, which you can kind of count as a loose piece. This knight is also undefended, and you could say loose, but it doesn't contribute specifically to this tactic, but it's another thing to look for. So of course, white can simply capture this pawn on g6. Of course, what would happen if black were to recapture?
He's going to lose his queen.
Yeah, takes, we have rook takes.
Is that what he did?
That's not what happened in the game, but this is the point of the tactic, right? We do this, and then I can actually just come over and checkmate him right away, and there's really nothing black can do. So he chose not to take. Instead, he tried to kind of defend in a tricky way with rook to d6. So he's activating his pieces, trying to have some active defenders. Just out of curiosity, what would happen if I did nothing here? Do you guys see?
You did nothing?
Mm-hmm. Obviously, I would do something, but if nothing were to happen, has black made a threat?
I mean, just trading off the rook, but...
Yeah, something better than trading off the rook, actually.
No, he's going to win the rook, isn't he? Oh, no, okay. No?
See, this is using some of those tactical motifs I talked about last week, if you remember.
Do nothing. So black to move
Can you
now?
just take the pawn now? Take the bishop now?
Yeah, so you can take the bishop, because this is actually an X-ray attack. So if the queen were to take, or if the rook were to take, the rook could take. And if the queen takes, again, the rook comes in the end. So, black's setting up, maybe an X-ray on the bishop. Of course, though, this pawn on h7 is simply hanging, so I captured it. The king went over. I just brought in my last piece into the attack. Queen h5 was played. I moved my bishop because it was attacked. Queen g5. I played queen d3. Here the engine says, oh, there are 1,000 better ways to play, but queen d3 is enough for me. He takes, and now one last combination to finish out the game.
Can you check with the queen?
Well, what's the whole line? What's the whole line?
King G7, Queen H7, check, King F6, Rook takes E6.
Yeah, and that would be finally checkmate. So Black's king is sadly too weak, not enough defenders. So I have check, check, and here is actually where he resigned. I think this is how the game ended. I know he resigned somewhere around here, because if King F6, Rook takes E6 would simply be a checkmate. So again, how do you think things went wrong for Black? What was the big thing that launched all of these, tactics, all of the pieces coming in?
Opening the center with F5.
Yeah, so F5 was really the big problem in the position. He played F5, and he should have realized, hey, my pieces aren't as active as my opponent's. I'm not really ready to do this yet. And he should have come up with something else. Maybe something as simple as like E6 here. Just, keeping his king a bit safer and, ready to open this up to bring his bishop out still, but keeping things more under control.
Yeah. No, I gotta get freaking prepared. Thanks, Caleb.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing your game, Perry. It was instructive stuff.
What's that?
This is your prep.
I gotta mentally prepare real quick.
Good luck, Perry.
Thanks.
Good luck, yeah.
Thanks.
So yeah, something like E6, less, kind of crazy, keeping it a bit more calm. Not opening the position until you're really sure you're ready to. So tactics at the beginner level, again, kind of just look like, missing things, not realizing my pieces are loose and attacked. Tactics at a slightly higher level are, not paying so much attention to what your opponent's doing, focusing on your own tactics. You want to realize, hey, I have weaknesses too, I have loose pieces too, things can happen to me. And then finally at my level, or the 1800 level, opening things up, letting your opponent have active pieces, and then tactics flow from there. So now I wanted to go all the way back to the 1800s and see what things looked like, back then, tactics-wise, how they handled things. So we see E4, E5, Knight F3, Knight C6, Bishop C4, Bishop C5, B4. So this opening doesn't get played very often anymore, but this was a pawn sacrifice that got played quite often in the 1800s, I believe. So it draws the bishop away, allows white to play this C3 move, which is preparing to break through in the center. With tempo, the black bishop moves. We see castles, D6, D4, bishop G4, bishop B5, takes. Excuse me. So already we see, there's a pin here, there's a pin here. Maybe white is threatening to play D5 and win the knight, so black is going to have to do something about that. We see bishop D7 in response. Bishop to B2. White continues to just develop. He's kind of eyeing this loose piece on G7, maybe threatening to play D5 and do something about it. So black actually just moves this knight away. This is the first kind of mistake, because he's spending too much time shuffling his pieces around and not enough time developing and getting castled. But this does stop the tactic with D5 and bishop takes G7. So this bishop is attacked, so white simply captures. Queen takes D7. Knight A3. So white is aiming to develop with tempo. They're both just fighting to have the more active pieces here. That's all that's happening, because once you have the active pieces, then the tactics start to flow. We see knight H6. This is a very odd move, and I don't know how to justify it for black, but he wanted to develop his knight that way. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Maybe it did to him. Of course, I would have preferred just the simple knight F6. This E5 move isn't really something to worry about. You'll simply take it, trade queens, and you can come up, you can come here, you can come here, you can come here, really anywhere. I don't think it matters a great deal. But yeah, knight H6 instead, I don't really understand it. Maybe he's better at chess than me, maybe he's worse at chess than me. It's unclear. Knight C4, attacking this loose piece, getting his pieces active with tempo. Bishop to B6, A4. Once again, we see a loose piece. White is actually threatening to trap it, so black has to spend more time dealing with that. Now we see E5. So once white has made sure he's got this piece on an active square, this piece controlling important squares, it's active. He's making this bishop active by opening the position. He's making this queen active by opening the position. So he's claiming, all right, the time has come. My pieces are ready for this. Your pieces aren't. That's when I'm going to open it up, and that's when I'm going to find tactics. And here, black actually agreed. Black said, wow, okay, you're right, your pieces are more active. I'm not ready to open it up, give you all these squares, so I'm going to play d5 and try to keep it closed instead. Unfortunately for Black, this actually gives White this nice check on d6. After king f8, we see bishop a3. Again, getting active pieces, so tactics can start to flow. King to g8, rook to b1. Getting more pieces active, every piece on an active square. Knight hf5. And now, just as a last question before you guys and the knights need to get out of here, what do you think White played here? You know, he's got an active piece here, an active piece here, an active piece here, an active piece here. He decided now was the time for me to start my attack or start, you know, looking for tactics. It's actually two options that kind of just win the game.
Knight g5.
Okay, so those are two options. e6, maybe Black can just take it. I'm not so sure what the point is. This knight's attacked now.
Right, okay.
Yeah, I don't like e6 so much. Knight g5, that's an interesting idea. Maybe this is somewhat good for White, or at least it would be. Maybe knight takes d6 is possible. You might play pawn takes and knight back to f5. Or bishop takes and also knight back to f5, and maybe this is okay for Black. So there's a simple way to do it, and then there's the way White did it in the game to try to win here. So let's talk about the simple way first. How can White kind of break through? What are the loose-looking pieces in Black's position? Pieces and pawns. Just throw them out there. What looks loose?
f7 pawn.
This f7 pawn looks a little loose, yeah. This knight is pretty well defended. It's the furthest advanced piece, but it is well defended. I would say this bishop looks a little loose. It can be attacked quite easily. And this pawn is attacked once and defended once, so I'd say it's also loose. So these are the loose pieces that I see in the position. So is there any way we can find a tactic here to take advantage of them? What was that?
a5.
Yeah, exactly. a5 is the simplest. I think it's also the best, actually. a5, simply making the bishop move, and then we're coming right in with this rook. And this is really far too much for Black to be able to deal with. Something like queen d8. And it's almost hard to pick between all the good moves here. Maybe knight f7 now. Maybe knight g5 now, maybe anything, maybe just takes and then knight g5. All of these moves look completely winning for White. So that was the first one. It took advantage of this loose piece and this loose piece. The way White did it in the game took advantage of the final loose piece. So with that in mind,
d-sac on the pawn.
just have the heart to play it. That's right. He just sacrificed right here.
King take knight check.
Yep, so the king took the knight. And yep, so again, there's only 5 minutes left. If you want to go prepare for the tournament, I won't be offended at all.
Is it knight check?
No, not quite knight check. He took advantage of the placement of these pieces here.
Pawn check.
Yeah, so pawn check.
Pawn check.
So the fork forces Black to recapture. Obviously, what happens if the queen takes?
Knight check.
Yeah, then this would be a fork. So the king took instead. Boy, White continued. There are a few different ways to win, including rook e1, g4 wins. He played knight e5 first. Maybe not the most accurate, but it gets the job done. I believe queen c8 was played. Now we see this move, rook to e1. Again, he's not really in a huge rush. He knows my pieces are far more active than my opponent's, and his king is weak. I'll simply bring more pieces into the attack until something has got to give, is basically White's thinking here. We see king to f6. Simply queen to h5, bringing yet another piece into the attack, looking for more tactics. Maybe queen f7 is a humongous threat. So Black plays g6. And now let's look for yet another tactic here. What do you think White tried? This one's a bit more subtle, I think, than the last one. So the first move that might come to mind is knight to g4. When after king to g7, you can take this knight, and maybe you go here instead. It does feel like this should be winning somehow, though, although your queen is hanging, so you do have to deal with that first.
So
And this position, I think, is winning for white, but something more forcing is what...
bishop takes e7.
Yes, so bishop e7 is actually the move that was played. And so the idea is if knight takes... What do we think here?
King's running out of squares.
Yeah, simply something like knight to g4, maybe queen to h4, and it should all be winning, I think. He played king takes instead, but of course, what does this allow?
Double check.
Yeah, this double check on g6. The black king has to move. White simply captures this rook. Black tries to take this pawn, and I'll just kind of quickly go rook b3. Again, a model example of bringing the last piece into the attack. Queen to d7, rook to f3. Rook takes, we see g4, rook g8, and now what is, let's see, well, first we have queen h6, rook g6, and now what's the last tactic that we see here?
Check.
This one ended the game. Yet not queen f8.
With the pawn.
With the pawn, maybe just king f7 then. Okay, everything's winning, but I'll just show you what was played in the game. We see this rook takes, which is a sacrifice, and then there's actually, this is not quite checkmate, but it's a skewer of the king and queen, and I don't know, we can see mate coming up quite quickly. I won't play any further, but yeah, so that's how it happened in the 1800s. There's a little, heavy-handed, a little just sacrifice, sacrifice, sacrifice. But once again, it all comes down to piece activity at these slightly higher levels. The person with the more active pieces is going to be the one finding the tactics. So that's how to recognize it, at that sort of level. I'll say goodbye to you. You're playing in the knights, right?
No.
No? All right. Well, then we're all in here for the long haul. I have one more level to show you, perhaps the highest level of chess. Let's see what tactics look like, between Fabiano Caruana and Sam Shankland.
Let's see that.
Yeah, so this was played, actually, it was a very short game. It was a 10-minute game. It was played on chess.com yesterday, actually. This was in the Pro Chess League, which, go Archbishops, because we're doing all right. We're doing all right. So we'll see how Fabi managed to take down Sam here. I'll play through the opening a little bit more quickly. It was an exchange Caro. They developed their pieces. This h3 move looks a little strange. It's just aimed at making this bishop look awkward. That's all it's doing, is taking away its last square for development. Knight f3, bishop f5, allowing white to take if he wants. White decided, no, I'm not interested. Castles, castles, bishop f4, knight e4, knight d2. We see the rooks come to the open file, or the semi-open file. Black pushes white's bishop a bit backwards, queen to d7. White goes ahead and trades off black's active piece, and activates his bishop again, and then unactivates the bishop. I don't really know what Fabi was doing here. We'll give him a pass because it was a 10-minute game, but this all looked a little bit strange to my eyes. We see f4. So black is again trying to get active pieces. He's blocking white's bishop out. So let's see how Fabi managed to untangle. We see bishop d3 yet again. Bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, e5, queen h5, e4. So this is something I wanted to talk about. This isn't necessarily related to tactics. It's more about piece activity. But can you find a plan to get both of white's bishops into the game? Because that's of the utmost importance here. First off, what are we going to do with this bishop? Let's decide that.
Let's put it on g4.
Yeah, exactly, right? That's totally natural, just putting it on g4. The next order of business is actually this bishop, though. How can we try to break free with that bishop?
We have to try and chip away at the pawn chain.
Yeah, but how can we actually achieve that? How can we chip away at the pawn chain when we have so few pawns left? Yeah, h4 is something to do. It's actually a pretty good idea, but Fabi chose a little bit of a different route. So what would be the main problem with something like g3? What would black play in response to something like g3, do you think?
You may push.
Yeah, he might just simply push, and then we're stuck behind our own pawn now. And we want to put this other bishop on g4, so it's tough to see how to break through with g3 if you can't play g4.
White hasn't moved his bishop yet.
Yeah, white hasn't moved his bishop yet. So first order of business is fixing this bishop, so he comes back to e2, rook e7, and he actually does come to this g4 square, the natural square. And now after queen e8, we do see this g3 break. So what do you think Fabi has in mind? Because Sam very quickly played f3, keeping the bishop stuck. So how do we get this last bishop to be active? How do we free it from behind the pawn chain?
Push the other pawn.
Yeah, we want to push this pawn, which is what I believe led Fabi to take on e8 and play bishop f5. He simply wants to play g4, get this last bishop into the game. And once his pieces are active, that's when the tactics start to flow. So we see rook to d8, g4, b5. Fabi plays b4, trying to stop black's minority attack. a5, and now this was actually black's big mistake. So why is a5 a mistake? White has a very specific move aimed at taking advantage of his piece activity.
Bishop e6? No, I'm sorry, never mind.
So let's think. What happened in my game against Neil?
He opened up and lost.
Yeah, he opened up the position, his pieces weren't quite ready, and then he lost the game. So how can white open it up? Because it looks like this bishop isn't quite ready for the opening of the queen side, and these rooks also aren't placed on the A and B files. So how can white open it up, get more pieces into the game, and then find tactics to eventually win?
Looks like we have two options. The simplest looks to be capturing on a5.
Well, yeah.
And playing rook b1.
You can capture on a5 and play rook b1. But the thing is, you haven't actually broken through, right? Black still has everything covered. Maybe he can simply play rook to b7, something like knight to c4, and then bring this bishop in, and your advantage might start to dwindle.
The other option that needs to be calculated is a4.
Yeah, so that's exactly right. Fabi simply plays a4, and now this is going to allow his rook to jump into the action, and you'll start seeing that black's pieces aren't well placed. So that's the key, is knowing when to open it up, when you have the better placed pieces, and that's where you'll find tactics in higher level games. So Sam tried to play b takes a. We see now b5, forcing this knight to an awkward square. Knight a7, simply rook e to b1, rook b7, b6, knight to c6. And now white has actually activated a piece that you don't often see very active. He's activated a pawn, and this allows him to finally break through and win material. How do you think that happened? Well, wait, hold on. Yeah, so bishop c7 is how it happened. This rook is stuck. Where can this rook actually go? I'm not entirely sure. Rook to e8, but now bishop to d7, and everything is hanging. So I'm not sure if Sam actually resigned here. No, he played king f7. We took the rook, and Fabi played on for a few more moves, and here Sam decided to resign. So it was a very simple tactic in the end. It was simply b6, bishop c7, and then this rook is just completely trapped. If it comes to someplace like f8, we still just play this bishop d7 move, I think. And yeah, the end is near. So any questions about how the tactics came about in this game, in my game, or even in the slightly lower level games, about the tactics there? All right, I just want to do a quick review of what I talked about today then. So you want to recognize tactics in your games. Tactics occur when you have active pieces, first of all, when your opponent has loose pieces, or a weak king, basically. So active pieces, loose pieces, and a weakness, like a weak king or a weak square. Other than that, I wanted to thank you all for watching, coming out to the class. This has been the Road to 2000, episode 2. all about recognizing tactics in your games. Hopefully, you'll be a little bit more aware when they show up. Thanks.